Wow, good morning. So we're in this message series. We're in the 6th week of 8 weeks talking about our hurts, habits, and hang-ups. Man, it's been so much fun, hasn't it, right? Because we all have hurts that are still tugging at us. We all have habits that are making a mess out of our life. And we all have hang-ups that we think we're never going to get rid of, or may think that we're never going to get rid of. And these hurts and these habits and these hang-ups, they didn't just come on overnight, and so they're not going to go away overnight. It's a process. It's a transformation. It's a journey of healing, and we can't just expect to snap our fingers and everything go back exactly the way that we want it to go back, right? So, I mean, if I'm having financial problems, I'm not in debt because I missed one payment. I'm not living paycheck to paycheck because I overspent one time. I'm not overweight because I overate one time. I don't have relationship issues because I didn't communicate one time. These things build up slowly over time, and it takes time for God to do His work of restoration in us. I don't know if you've noticed the platform here at Aldersgate, if you've been here somewhat regularly during this message series, but it has transformed slowly over time. The very first Sunday we launched this message series, there was just some raw wood up here that was unfinished, unstained, and then the next week there was some stain put on it, and then there was some color put on it, and then some lights were added to it, and then some Christmas decorations and some garland, and it's just an example of that's exactly how God works in us. A little bit at a time, slowly over time, and over the next couple of weeks it will continue to be transformed until it's complete for our Christmas Eve services. And so we've been working through these steps, if you will, or these principles by which God brings us restoration, or why He brings us freedom or recovery. And so just to review them briefly, not all of them, you can go back and catch any of these messages online, but the first thing we have to recognize is that we are powerless over our hurt, our habit, or our hang-up. We've tried and we've tried and we've tried to find healing. We've tried and we've tried and we've tried to fix that habit or that hang-up. And we have to get to the place where we admit that we are powerless to do anything about it. And that moves us into the next step or the next principle where we have to recognize that there is an all-powerful God who can transform us. And if we just give everything to Him, if you've been through any recovery program, if you know anything about recovery, you know that we talk about a higher power. And I've said to you, the higher power is Jesus Christ, and I want you to know Him. I want you to know the power of His life and His work in your life. And we have to submit those things that we're powerless over, our hurts, our habits, and our hang-ups to Him, to where we get to this step that we said that really separates those who are serious about recovery from those who just want to talk about the idea or play with the idea. And that is, we have to get honest and vulnerable and say, this is where I'm hurting, this is my habit, this is my hang-up. And we have to do that with ourselves, to God, and at least to one other person that we trust. And in that, we find healing. Last week, we were at principle number 5, which says then we have to surrender to any change that God wants to make in our life. To any change that God works in my life. Because see, if we're going to get to the place where we're open and honest and vulnerable and say, man, God, this is where I'm struggling. This is the habit that I can't break. This is the hang up that it continues to hang around with me. See what I did there? And so if we're going to get to that place and then God begins to say, all right, then here's what you need to do. Here's where you need to change. Here's where you need to grow. Here's what you need to give up. Here's what you need to surrender. We go, whoa, 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 whoa. No, I didn't want to do that. I don't want you to go messing there. I don't want you to start changing that. We have to get to the place where we submit and surrender to any change that God wants to do in our lives. And sometimes that's tough and it's painful. Today we're going to move on to the 6th step or the 6th principle. It simply says this: evaluate all my relationships. All my relationships, not just the ones that are going well, but also those that are trying to speak into me and say, hey, you don't really have self-awareness of this in your life. You need to get some self-awareness, right? Because it's so easy to see that in other people. You can look around at the room of people and you go, yeah, here's their hurt, here's their habit, here's their hang-up. but it's so hard to do in ourselves, right? We have to evaluate all of our relationships, and we have to offer forgiveness to those who have hurt me and make amends for harm I've done to others, except when to do so would harm them or others. We've been in the Beatitudes in this message series, so if you got a Bible or a phone with you, Matthew chapter 5. The Beatitudes are the beginning of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount and preaching to his disciples after he called them to follow him. I'm going to give you a whole lot of scripture this morning, and so I would encourage you to get your notes section out in your phone or an app or a piece of paper and write down a lot of these scriptures so that you can go back and study them this week. This morning I'm going to give you a twofer on the Beatitudes. There's two Beatitudes I'm going to give you. The first one is Matthew chapter 5, verse 7. It says, blessed, we've talked about that word meaning happy or fulfilled, content. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are those who want to give out mercy, so they should receive mercy. This is a principle that's from the beginning of the Bible to the end of the Bible, that whatever we sow, we're going to reap. If we give out mercy, we will get mercy. If we give out grace, we will receive grace. If we give out judgment, we're going to receive judgment. If we're willing to hand out mercy, if we're willing to give forgiveness, then we will receive forgiveness. If we're willing to go to those that we need to seek forgiveness from, then we will receive forgiveness. Matthew chapter 5, verse 9 is the second one. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the sons of God. If we're willing to forgive those who have hurt us, but if we're willing to go to those that we need to ask forgiveness from, if we're willing to keep the peace, to be a peacemaker, then we'll be called the sons of God. So this morning, as we look at this step or this principle, there's two different things we need to look at. Number one is we need to look at forgiving those that have hurt us. And the second thing we need to look at is making amends to those that we have hurt. So first of all, we're going to look at forgiving those who have hurt us. And we're going to ask the questions, why and how? Why do I need to forgive those who have hurt me? Why do I need to offer forgiveness? I'm going to give you 4 reasons this morning. This is not an exhaustive list, but it's a good start. 4 reasons on why we need to forgive. Number 1, because God has forgiven me. Because God has forgiven me. I will never forgive anyone else more than God has forgiven me. I'll never be able to out-forgive God. Colossians chapter 3, verse 13. As the Lord has forgiven you, so you also must forgive. If you are having a hard time forgiving someone else, listen, I'm very well aware this morning that when we start talking about forgiving those that have hurt us, people begin to come to your mind. You begin to see their face. You begin to bring up the incident or the episode, and I know that with that can come some hurt. And you feel it right now. And you're thinking to yourself, I'm not there. I can never forgive that person. You have I don't need to have any idea. Here's what I want you to hear. If you are having a hard time forgiving someone else, stop and remember how much God has forgiven you. If you're starting at struggling to forgive someone else, that's the wrong starting point. Don't start with trying to forgive someone else. Start by remembering how much God has forgiven you. We must forgive because God has forgiven us. Let me give you a second reason. Because resentment doesn't work. I have never had anyone in my office send me an email, text me, or whatever, and say, you know what, Ryan? This resentment is just going really, really, really well for me right now. This bitterness is just working so wonderfully in my life right now. I've never had anybody say that to me. I've never been able to say it to anybody else about myself. Because Hebrews chapter 12, verse 15. Let no root of bitterness spring up and cause what? trouble. We're trying to find freedom from our hurts and from our habits and our hang-ups, but if we're holding on to bitterness from how someone hurt us, whether it was 10 minutes ago or 10 years ago, then we're just adding fuel to the fire. We're just continuing to hurt ourselves even more because resentment won't work. You see, we think, oh my gosh, I want evil for that person. I want them to get repayment. I want something bad to happen to them in life. You know, I want it. Come on, let's just be honest, right? That's sometimes what we think. And we begin to get angry and we begin to cuss and we begin to spew and all of that turns into this bitter. And listen, it's not hurting anybody but ourselves. The other person's not even aware you're losing sleep at night. They're not even aware you're praying that 1,000,000 scorpions would crawl into their bed at nighttime. You're the only one losing sleep, and spewing and cussing and getting angry. Resentment will never work. I want you to hear this clearly, though. It doesn't mean that you excuse the hurt. It doesn't mean that you just let it go. It doesn't mean that you forget it. It doesn't mean that you want that. It doesn't mean that the other person will even change or will make it right. It doesn't mean any of that. But you've got to let it go. You've got to forgive because resentment won't work. Let me give you the third reason. Because I need forgiveness in the future. Because I need forgiveness in the future. This is incredible to me. Listen to this, Mark 11:25. Whenever you stand praying, forgive. If you have anything against anyone, so that your Father who is in heaven may forgive your trespasses. Matthew chapter 6, verse 12 is the Lord's Prayer. Jesus taught us to pray, and he said, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. Right? We've been forgiven, so we have to forgive those who trespass against us. Listen, resentment, I want you to hear this clearly. Our resentment, our unwillingness to forgive, does not mean that God does not forgive us, but it does mean that we can struggle knowing that God forgives us, or feeling that God forgives us. That's what Mark's saying. That's what the Lord's Prayer is all about. And we've got to be careful that we don't block knowing that God has forgiven us because we're unwilling to forgive someone else. John Wesley one time was counseling a person over an issue, a hurt, a wound that had been done to them, and the person said to John Wesley, I can never forgive them. And John Wesley said back, then I hope you never sin again. Here's what John Wesley said. Because we all need what we don't want to give. Wow. We all need what we don't want to give. You see, we all want grace, but sometimes we're really reluctant to extend grace. We all want mercy, but sometimes we're really hesitant to give mercy to other people. We all want forgiveness, but sometimes we don't want to give forgiveness to other people. We're going to need forgiveness in the future, which is why we need to forgive today. Let me give you a fourth reason. Again, this is not an exhaustive list, but a fourth reason. Because God is the one responsible for settling the score, not you. Just two verses. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 9. Do not repay evil for evil, but on the contrary, bless. For to this you were called, that you may obtain a blessing. There's that principle again. Whatever you give, you receive. Whatever you sow, you reap. Romans chapter 12, verse 19. Never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God, for it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. All right, so how do we forgive them? Okay? If those are some of the reasons we need to forgive, the why behind it, then how do we do it? Number one, you've got to be honest with what you need to forgive. You need to be honest with the person you need to forgive. You need to stop trying to pack it down and think it's going to go away. Listen, when we take a hurt, an offense that's been done to us, and we think we can be all Superman and just pack it down and pack it down and pack it down and be okay with it, you know what eventually ends up happening? The same thing when you keep packing gunpowder down into something. It eventually explodes. And then what happens? Now you've hurt someone else. You've heard it, right? Hurting people hurt people. Wounded people wound people. And this is the place we're not even self-aware. We've been hurt in our life, and we've tried to repress it and push it down and press it down and make it go away, and we're hurting other people with our words and with our actions, and we're not even aware of it. We've got to be honest. We've got to be willing to admit that it hurt. I'm angry, and I'm broken. We got to get honest about it. And once we get honest about it, then we've got to begin to release the offender. We've got to begin to release them from their actions. Well, how do we do that? Well, let me give you one thing. One thing you can do is begin to pray for them. Okay, and again, I'm not praying the whole scorpion thing or, God, would you please have another car run the red light when they're going through the green light. I'm not saying pray that. Here's what you do. You begin to pray God's best in their life. And even if you don't mean it, pray it. Because in the process of praying it, God will begin to change your heart. Remember, it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take a season. It's going to take a journey. But you begin to pray for that person. You begin to pray God's best for that person. You begin to pray God's best in their life. And then you begin to ask God, when is the right time to have a conversation with this person? And we can do that several different ways, all right? I call it several different ways. Number one, you can have a chair-to-chair conversation, okay? That's real simple. You call them up, you text them and say, hey, would you like to have lunch? Would you like to have coffee? I want to visit with you. And you sit down and you be honest about the hurt in your life. And face-to-face, you share with them how they've hurt you. Listen, you don't know how they're going to respond. You're not responsible for how they respond. Now, sometimes you might go, oh my gosh, to do a face-to-face meeting, that would just make things worse. Or maybe that person's not even around, or maybe it's not possible to sit face-to-face with them. Then here's what you do. You do chair to empty chair. I'm not making this up, all right? You get in a room, preferably all by yourself, so you don't end up institutionalized somewhere, all right? And you put a chair, and no one's there, and you have the conversation with an empty chair. Why? Because it's not about the other person, it's about you. You're not even seeking it, and I'm sorry. I want to make this right. It's for you. If that's not your thing, if you can't talk to an empty chair, then get out some paper or get a journal and begin to write. And write exactly what you would say to them. Listen, you've rehearsed it in your mind 100 times already. Write it down. And don't just continue rehearsing it in your head, because there's something very powerful about writing it down. You may never mail the letter, you may never give it to them, but it's an exercise of healing for you. And you work through that process of forgiving them by writing out exactly what you would say, or talking to an empty chair. Or, hey, by the way, how do you know if you've gotten to the place where you've truly released the offender? If you've truly forgiven the person who hurt you or wounded you? Here's how you know. You no longer want 1,000 scorpions to crawl into their bed at night. You want the very best for them. That's how you know that you've forgiven them. And that takes a long time. Longer than 8 weeks. It's a journey. This morning, I could take anything, right? I could take any wound, I could take any hurt, some that are very common to us or familiar with us, and I could work through that wound or that hurt and go through these steps with us. But I have felt very compelled during this message series to take one wound and one hurt. I think it's something that the church sometimes wants to sweep under a rug and not talk about, and I think we need to talk about it. And so this morning, I want to help us work through these steps of forgiving an offender by working through the offense of abuse. Whether it's physical, verbal, emotional, mental, sexual. As if this is making you uneasy because you know that this is in your past, or you know it's a hurt or a wound that you're struggling with, I want you to know you're in good company. Did you know that physical abuse is the number one cause of injury to women in the United States of America. And that every 9 seconds, a woman is physically abused. There are 3 times more animal shelters in our country than there are shelters for victims of abuse. So you are either a victim of abuse, whether it be physical, verbal, mental, emotional, sexual, or you know someone who is. And it will lead to a lifetime of damage if it's not dealt with. And you don't find restoration and healing and recovery. And so with all sensitivity, I want to speak to you and I want to say, don't keep it a secret. Don't try to push it down. Don't think you can be strong enough to heal yourself. Remember step 1, you are powerless over your situation. And you can work through all these steps and you can finally get to this step or to this principle where you know that you have to forgive because God has forgiven you. And you can focus on how much God has forgiven you first rather than focusing on how much you have to forgive your offender. You can begin to pray God's best in their life, even if you don't mean it. And you may get to a place where God says it's time to have a chair-to-chair conversation, or if it's not time for a chair-to-chair conversation, maybe a chair-to-empty chair, or you're going to write a letter or write out your thoughts. But I also want to remind you, don't forget, you've got to be honest with yourself, honest with God, and honest with at least one other person about the abuse that you've suffered. And in that, God can begin to work an incredible healing in your life. I want you to hear that you are not responsible for the abuse, but you are responsible for your healing. All right, let's move on to making amends to those that I've hurt. So we've got to forgive those that have hurt us. We've got to make amends to those that I've hurt. Why? Matthew chapter 7, verse 12. So whatever you wish that others would do to you, you do also to them. Right? If someone has offended you, then you want them to say they're sorry. You want them to try to make restitution for the wounds that they have given you or the hurt that they've caused you or the damage they've done in your life. And so the golden rule says, do unto others as you want them to do unto you, Matthew 7:12. So if we've offended or hurt others, then we need to go and seek amends. We need to go and make amends or restitution. We need to do what we can. How do we do that? The same way we go about seeking forgiveness. Begin to pray. Pray for that person that God is bringing the very best in their life, even though you tried to mess that up. Call them up and have a conversation. Maybe it's a chair-to-chair conversation, or maybe you're a chair to an empty chair conversation, or maybe you need to write it out, or you need to journal it out, and you may never let them see it. They may never have access to it, but you've got to begin to work through these steps. And I know some of you are sitting there going, well, I don't know. I mean, I can't think of really a time that I need to go make amends with someone else. I made a list for you to help you out, all right? Is there anyone I've judged prematurely? Any debt I haven't repaid? Any promise I haven't kept? Anyone I'm guilty of trying to control or over-control, like my spouse, my children, my siblings, my employees? Anyone I'm overly possessive of? Anyone I'm overly negative or hypercritical of? Anyone I've been abusive to? Anyone I've neglected? Anyone that I've been unfaithful to or betrayed? Anyone I've lied to? Anyone that I've hurt in any way? This morning, I'm going to give you some time. But before I do that, I just want to remind you that this is all leading up to the launch of a brand new worship experience at Aldersgate on January 8th. It's going to be on Wednesday evenings. It's going to meet at 6 o'clock. It'll be a time of worship and a time of working through these principles. And listen, you will not find recovery from listening to this message series. It's real encouraging to me, by the way. But you will find recovery if you get into a community of people who are also in recovery and begin to work through these principles together. If you have interest and you haven't responded to us already, then I would encourage you to do that. You can take out your phone right now if you want to. You can do it any time, but right now is great. 806-745-0595. Give us the word restore. We're just going to kind of follow up with you and let you know a little bit more details about the worship concerns. Will be starting January 8th. If you have anybody that you would like to bring with you or invite, you can go ahead and respond to that as well. And it's just weeks away. And as you get to that point or to that place, and here's what I want you to do this morning. I just want you to get to a place where you can hear from God. We've already heard it from the platform this morning. God is not silent. God speaks. He speaks to me. He speaks to you. And I want you to get into a position this morning where you can hear from God, whether it's your eyes open, eyes closed, Bible open, Bible closed, phone open, phone closed. I don't care. Just get into a place where you can hear from God. And here's what I want you to do. I want you to ask God to speak to you. It's just as simple as saying, God, what are you speaking to me right now? What are you speaking to me today? God, where do I need to forgive those who've hurt me? I know some of you this morning, God's already been speaking to you. You see their face, you know their name. You may have to sit with God for a while to see names or to see faces, but just ask Him, God, show me. Who do I need to forgive? Where do I need to forgive? Where have I been holding on to this resentment? Where in my unawareness have I been hurting others because of this bitterness that I've been living with? And when you're ready, I'm not rushing you. You're going to have plenty of time this morning. Because God, where do I need to make amends to others? Who do I need to seek out and ask for forgiveness? We don't want to rush anything this morning. The prayer team's going to be here at the front. The band's going to sing, but listen, I want you to hear me. You're not obligated to stand. You're not obligated to sing. Your only obligation this morning in this moment is to hear from God and to be obedient to what He's asking you to do.